right before it fell down.
Hey, thanks for coming and your attention. Very good turnout, glad to see it. Just to go on the record, I had nothing to do with the building. Just good timing. Today we have Terry Feinberg from University of Illinois Extension. She's been in many communities, seen many of the same things happen in different communities too. Before we go to you, Janie, would you like to talk about the buildings that we're going to be talking about? Got some information, some history on the various buildings.
Well, many of you know that the Lanark book is just right traveling to the printer as we speak, and so this happened to be one of the real short articles that's going to appear in that 150th book, and the title of it is Brick Buildings. As noted a bit earlier, a few of the early buildings, businesses, and homes were constructed of brick in Lanark prior to 1880. Over in Mount Carroll, the Hallett family was synonymous with brick making in the area. Lanark was rather late in the game, but in 1883 formed a Brick Makers Association. In January of 1883, they held the annual meeting at the City Hall, and it tells who those board members were. The brickyard was located down on Lower Broad Street with several other manufacturing places operating there. One being the Vinegar Works, a couple of rug weavers, an early ice house, and of course the famous Cotta family that was working on the four-wheel drive car. So when the move started to modernize the downtown area, brick was the building material of choice. The Paley block, kitty-cornered from the Shumway building, was built in 1882 by John Paley. He bought the lot from Joe Yeager and built a two-story brick structure in 1882. In 1883, a Gazette story noted W.H. Strickler as occupying the building with a large assortment of funeral coffins, burial robes, and so forth. Also a fine line of walnut, oak, ash furniture with or without marble. 7 kinds of cane-seated chairs, 5 kinds of wood seats, sinks, tables, frames, shelves, and mirrors. The building had served Lanark well in many capacities throughout the years. The building across the street, north from Paley's, served as the National Bank for many years and held the post office in the rear portion that was removed many years ago. The next building up the street was built in 1888 after a disastrous fire earlier in the year. This building contained 4 houses of trade. After the fire, the space was cleared of debris and a building constructed that when viewed from the front appears to look as though only one large storefront, but in reality has 2 separate ones. This contains the date of 1888 in its zinc-coated facade. It currently houses Eisenhart Real Estate Firm in the north. Next from Eisenhart's location is the Valentine Building, and that was built in 1879. The last occupant there was Shears Variety, and they closed there in 2004. In 1881, Lon Heth built the storefront north of Valentine's. This is a 2-story brick affair and had its beginning as a meat market and a grocery, as well as an oil company. Today, it still houses a grocery store. Sitting next to the Heth is the building carrying the name of Stover. It was constructed by Henry Stover, and it is used by the present grocery store as well. These buildings have nearly always been grocery stores. It was once owned by Phillips and Clemmer, as well as Root and Williams in the early days. Next, up the street is the Hess and Son building. This was once prominent as a 2-story building. The upper level was known for many years as Hess Hall, and held the Lanark Theater. It has served, as well as others have, the town faithfully. However, in the 1980s, the second story was removed. The wonderful tin cornice containing the Hess name was removed, but dutifully replaced on the remaining first floor. The building north of Hess at the southeast corner of Broad and Carroll was in the P.D. Wales family for over 60 years. This is one of the first buildings. It was reported that it was first built as a small shack with some of the very first lumber hauled to town, then rebuilt, and has had many uses over the years. So this is just one little brief sampling of what's included in the 150th book, and you still can reserve a copy of that book or of the many DVDs that are going to have thousands of pictures on. So a little commercial for the 150th book.
And when she said a little piece, it's a little piece. There's 432 pages, over 130 articles. So, lots of reading, lots of pictures.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. As John said, my name is Terry Feinberg, and I do I'm a community and economic development educator for University of Illinois Extension. I used to work in 21 counties in Northwest Illinois, but about a year ago, we reorganized and started a new phase of extension, and now I work in Carroll, Lee, and Whiteside, which I have to say are three of the favorite, I'm not kidding you, really, I'm being serious, three of my favorite counties out of the 21. So I was really happy with that opportunity. However, we now have a little bit different role to play. I used to just come in, do a program, some of the things that John might be from, or some of you others might be familiar with. But now that I'm a local educator, I get to work a little bit more closely with programs. So in addition to doing this program today, if there are other things that you guys are interested in, and I'm going to explain one little thing in a second that might be a part of that, please just give our office a call and we'll see what we can do to get you that education or facilitation or whatever it is that you think you might need. We can probably hook you up with someone or do the programming ourselves. But right now we are one of your biggest educational and information resources that you have, so please use us. Now, having said that, about, I don't know, how long ago was this, maybe 4 months ago?
Probably more than that, I think.
Some long time ago, John and I were talking about a completely unrelated program and decided that, John said, you know, we really could use you to come in and talk about absentee landlords. And we figured maybe 6, 8, 10 people with John and myself. And so it was pretty much going to be sort of a roundtable kind of thing. Talk about the issues that you see, and then I would share some of the information I had, maybe talk about what next steps might be. And then the other day I get a notice from John that says, building fell down. And it didn't really connect with me, because the thing that you sent said something with the weather, and I thought, well, that's a awfully interesting building to come down with weather. Spoke to John last night, and he said, well, I'm thinking we're going to have about 50 people, and you were pretty close. Because I only have 35 handouts, so how many of you did not get one? You get to count yourself over 35, pretty darn close. So because of that, I put this together today. Now this again is a culmination of information that I have. I made a few phone calls, talked to a few people to see what else might be out there that we can get. But know that this is not a comprehensive list, but it's sure going to take you a long way in thinking about how to handle issues. Now, I also noticed when I got here and talked with a few of you out before the program started that the program or the flyer introduced this as downtown revitalization. And I can talk to that as well, but as John pointed out, this is pretty much the first thing that you guys need to kind of consider and deal with and look at before you can get to other issues of revitalization. But depending upon the time and how comfortable everybody is, and if you're still awake, once we go through this, we can start talking about specific things to think about with downtown revitalization, or, as I said before, I can come back and do that as well. So just kind of think about that. We have a lot of programs. I said, and John mentioned, I've been working in 21 counties in Northwest Illinois for 12 years now. So I have a lot of information, a lot of programming that I can bring to bear. So please feel free to give me a call, and if you want, you can grab my card up here. Okay, so we're going to start talking about dealing with absentee landlords. And probably the one thing you're going to hear me say more than anything else is always start with your city attorney. Now I'm going to be showing you best practices that have been used throughout the nation. And in fact, some of them, a couple are even pulled from Great Britain, because this problem of absentee ownership or absentee landlordism is rampant throughout the world. So just keep that in mind, that just because someone else found it as a really good way to go, doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work for you. You may not have the legal authority, whether it's based in Illinois statute or legislation or local ordinances or county ordinances. And the first person you always want to talk with about that, so now I'm giving you all kinds of work to do in the next little while, is your city attorney. Because even if he doesn't know right now, he certainly has the resources to be able to find out what you can legally do. And I will tell you right now, you can do anything you want. You can go in and claim eminent domain on every single building in downtown that you don't like, as long as you're willing to take on those consequences. And one of the ways to find out what some of those consequences would be is, I met your IML risk management representative earlier this afternoon. So I know that you're all a member of IML, the Illinois Municipal League, and they have an insurance pool of their own that communities are in. Are you guys in that one? Yes. Okay, so what you want to do as just a kind of an interesting way to see what consequences can be is give your insurance pool a call and say, tell us some of the things that have happened because cities have made choices through policy, ordinance, whatever, that have backfired on them, so that you get a sense of, you really need to understand, you do not move forward until you've checked everything. Okay? So there's a lot of options I'm going to be presenting to you today to think about. Don't ever do any of them without planning and talking to your city attorney. Now here's the really big question. Do you have a zoning commission or a commissioner in the area, in this community? You do? Excellent. Okay, not a lot of communities do, particularly in Illinois. I'm not quite sure why. Indiana is very similar. You really want, anytime you're going to start talking about what you're doing with your downtown, you want to incorporate either if you have a commission or a commissioner or however it is that it works, you want to bring those people in for conversations. Because again, there are certain things that some people know. I'm on the planning commission for Freeport, which is where I live now, and there are things that, and I've been working in government for some major communities in this nation, and that I've never heard of before as particular kinds of rules, regulations, predominantly ordinance or policy. So again, you want to bring in as many people as you can to get those questions asked, to think about multiple sides of things, because some of these they're pretty easy, some of them are going to be a little radical. So as much as you would love to have these happen and happen tomorrow, you do want to recognize you want to go through a process before you move. So have I given all the disclaimers I need? Everybody gets that now? All right, great. Okay, the first thing that every single best practice community does is they try to know who their absentee landlords are. Now part of the problem is sometimes you just don't have names, you don't have information. Buildings get sold without you having a clue until the sale is already done. And even then, you could be a tenant and not really know exactly who it is that's your landlord. And that's key. We're going to talk about some ways that you might be able to find that out over time. But the key is that if you know who your absentee landlords are, some of them could be very positive members of your community. I don't mean living here, but contributors. So you don't want to necessarily make the assumption just because someone's an absentee landlord that they're out to, jerk everybody around in the community. There are issues even for the, best and well-intentioned people who don't live in communities, and we'll talk about how you might be able to get beyond that. But what you really want to know is, why do they have that building? So for example, some people are looking quickly to turn around a building. We're not talking like flip that house or whatever it's called on A&E, where they do things first and then make big money, they hope to buy low and sell a little bit higher. And in small communities, often that happens a lot more than we think or want to think. Some of them might want to buy, rent, and really do nothing, not deal with any of the issues, just collect that rent as best they can because they're not local. So you want to know, is that what their intention is? And then you've got something that where people will be looking at, buying low and waiting for the market to improve, and then they're just going to sell to the first person who meets the price. So you've got all three of these kinds of negative issues, and all of these really have a negative impact on the community. You probably already know this. And then if you're lucky, you get those absentee landlords who really are looking for an investment and recognize that to make their investment pay, they're going to have to actually do something. Rehabbing the building, or at least keeping it up at the level that it was when they purchased it. We're going to talk about ways that you might be able to guarantee how those buyer to seller changes happen. Again, remember, caution, talk to your city attorney before you try anything. So the first thing you want to look at anytime a building is available is what options you might have to assist local buyers. Because every single study, and I have to say there aren't that many of them, but every study that's out there says if you live local and you own, you're much more likely to take care of that property. So that's what you want to encourage. People who are local, who might have the ability to buy, but maybe need a little bit of help. So you've got a few things you can do. Normally, low interest loans are a real incentive. I just refinanced my house at 2% over prime, and it's like 2.08. So clearly not a very big issue on making sure you get low interest. But what do we know? We're not seeing a lot of loans be made. So you want to find ways that you can encourage your local banks, or you can find ways to sort of be a guarantor as a city. There are ways to do that. They're a little tricky, not something I really truly recommend, but you never know. You really never know what those options are going to be. You might want to look at some down payment options, which might mean the community itself has a fund that will help buyers who are local buy into, as long as they can get the loan on their own, buy into a building. So the city doesn't have to put the whole, a dollar amount down on that building to get it to a place where it's going to be really, really positive for them. So again, think about options for a down payment. Then for new business, you can always look to tax credit options. Never do any tax credit option long term. It is always going to turn around and kick you in the butt. However, to start out with something, give a little bit of tax incentive, maybe even make a deal with local landowners, if they are local, that have buildings around here, to help new business come in, because as new business comes into one building or one storefront, the next storefront that's empty is going to have that much more ability to get filled. The more empty you have, the more empty you're going to continue to get. As you start to fill, even if you get one or two new businesses in there, you start to see many more interested. Nobody wants to open up a storefront next to an empty one. So you always want to keep that in mind. So let's talk about a couple of other incentives. We're going to talk a little bit about creation of nonprofits. You guys don't have a CDC or any kind of nonprofit that deals with housing or buildings or any of that kind of stuff in this community, right?
Yes, we do.
You do. What do you have?
Tom?
Well, the Cornerstone Project, we formed in order to take over the Shumway building. Instead of having it demolished, we made an arrangement with the city that they gave us the money that they were going to use to tear it down rather than. So we put some money in, and now it's been sold.
Is your nonprofit status limited to that building? Is it restricted to just that one? So you are incorporated as a nonprofit, 501c3. You are a C3. Okay, and are you considering staying in business?
We're considering, yeah.
That's perfect. Again, don't ever just assume because it's there, it's the option for you. But this is exactly the kinds of things that we're talking about. You actually got a donation to take care of the building and to turn it around and sell it. Sometimes you can get no interest or low interest loans. that are given. I used to run community development for the city of Indianapolis. We got federal dollars to do that with through CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Funds, and we got it in the millions. I'm not assuming you guys are going to have that same luck at this level, but it doesn't mean that there isn't financing there. And clearly, although it may not seem that way today, at some point, Illinois is going to have to get out of this current situation. And when it does, one of the things that we hope will be available is to do improvement in communities as one of those first kinds of granting things that they're going to have coming out of, whether it's DCEO or wherever in the state. So keep your eyes open for those kinds of opportunities. If you already have this 501c3 in place, try to keep it, even if it's not doing anything. Keep your officers in it so that the status will remain. You don't have to actually be doing anything at that time, because you never know what opportunities are going to come down the pike, and that is probably the number one option for you to do a whole variety of things depending upon what the bylaws and charters say. So you want to look to do basically what you guys did with that building, pretty much exactly that. One of the other things that you might want to look to do is some of the people who do own your buildings here, who are local, and this applies to housing as well, because housing and business are interlinked. No matter how you try to separate them, the people in the community are interlinked to their downtown or business districts or whatever. So you want to make sure that you have the ability for people to stay in place when they want to, but aren't sure they can. So a lot of times, and you're looking in the literature, they refer to those kinds of ownership as the mom and pop, the individual, the couple who you mentioned. Many of these buildings have been in the same hands, the same families for year after year, and then they have to sell because either there's no one left in the family, there's no one left in the community in the family, or they just say, you know what, it's too expensive for us to maintain. At that point, if you can look at how can you encourage the existing landowners to maintain their property, keep it up to code, keep it up to a level where if they want to rent or if they want to keep their own storefront, if that's indeed what they have, you will be able to help them through that. And you know what? It doesn't cost a thing. And I'll tell you why. Because you have a lot of educational resources in the area. You've got Sauk, you've got Highland, depending upon where you all live. Certainly have Extension. And these are the kinds of resources you can turn to for little or no cost to help educate people in your community to be able to do the kinds of things that are preventing them from maintaining their properties. Clearly, you talked about this same sort of thing. Consider purchasing some of the buildings in the area. If you do that, do not simply purchase without a plan. That means you sit down, you talk to your city attorney, you talk to your zoning people, we're going to talk about a number of other people you'll be talking to and other things. You really want to make sure before you put $1 down on a property of any kind, even if it was to say, well, we were going to demolish it, we're now going to give the money over to this, what's the name of the organization again? Cornerstone, okay? We're just going to give the money to Cornerstone. Don't do it if you don't know what that plan is. Because, local government officials can get into trouble even if they don't allegedly embezzle $50.2 million. Okay, you have to recognize that when you are at that position, when you are an elected official, there is an awful lot more responsibility that goes with that than you deciding whether or not you're going to close your business doors, whether you're going to move into an apartment and rent your house. Whatever it is, personal decisions are just pretty much about you and the community around you. You have a lot more onus on you if you happen to be an elected official or an appointed official. So make sure that before you do anything as a community, that you have a plan first. The second big thing is do not purchase a building at the seller's price simply because you want that building out of that seller's hands. Because one of the reasons why we have a lot of vacant buildings is the absentee landlord says, I know what price I should get for this and I'm not going to go any lower. And they may not be paying taxes. If they paid back taxes when they purchased, they got a few years before they really have to do anything without, you know, the law really coming down on them. So there's a lot of things that a seller can do, as you probably already know, when they're absentee, that because if they're not absentee, what happens? If I live here, I'm not paying my taxes, I'm not refinishing the building, I'm, you know, not working to get good renters in there, what are you guys all gonna do? You're gonna come after me and say, excuse me, Terry, why aren't you taking care of that building? Okay, you are gonna do that. There will be pressure from the community. It's one of the advantages of having local people. Plus, again, local people tend to want to keep their community at least a level that's livable and doesn't cause negative impact on the community. So if you purchase at the price that seller wants, the next time somebody wants to sell a building, the expectation is they're gonna get the same. Which means then the city has to think about it again. Well, should we purchase that just to get it out of the hands of that person? And you know, you really, if the building is not worth that much, if the property is not worth that much, then you do not want to pay that. There will be other ways that you can get through to have more local ownership or better absentee landlords than going ahead and purchasing a building just to get it out of the hands of that seller. Now, again, you're going to hear me say this and see it up on here again, do not make these purchases without a plan. Because if you do go and buy the building, now you're stuck with the building if you have no real solid plan about what to do with it. And if you had purchased that building across the street to get it out of the hands of the estate, which you couldn't have done at the moment anyways, but assuming that you were going to, and what happens? Now not only have you purchased a building in good faith, but now you got to pay for cleanup. So you really want to make sure that you know what you're getting into when you purchase locally. And I love to encourage communities to purchase locally when they can, but again, you do it through a nonprofit or you find other ways to make that change that's necessary. Okay, well, you guys already considered this clearly and you made it happen, which is develop a nonprofit to do the purchase. You guys are not a community development corporation, is that correct? You might want to consider that if you stay in place because there are some advantages to being a CDC, including the opportunity for funding, maybe not today, but in the near future that you wouldn't have before. And there is an organization called LISC, L-I-S-C, which I can never remember, Local Initiative Support Corporation, I think is what it is. I think, boy, it's been a long time. And they have a rural component, which all of you would fit, you know, the community here would fit into. It's all a population thing. And they provide a lot of technical support that you would not be able to get on your own without expending an awful lot of time. And yes, there is a membership, you do pay for it, so you do want to consider the, you know, pros and cons of that. But as the person doing community development in the city of Indianapolis, LISC itself, not rural LISC, but LISC was probably our strongest partner. And that's why I'm kind of high on them. But again, you know, you always want to make your own decisions. CDCs, like nonprofits, but they have a little bit more ability to be agile and flexible, both in what they take in and what they can do. And so as you charter, whether you're doing it as a CDC or just a nonprofit, you really want to make sure that your charter allows you to do things, but that you are protected and that it's not a single individual's decision to make those choices. Most of these nonprofits require multiple people to make choices. And once again, do not purchase without a plan. Okay, this is something which it almost kind of sounds like, yeah, right, it's going to happen, but you'd be surprised. If one of your lenders, let me try this again. If your seller's lender and you can make a connection, you can ask and even require through policy or ordinance, you can make the lender provide the city the first option to buy. So if you've got a building that someone puts on the market, one of the landlords here, whether they're local or absentee, the minute that comes out on the market, or before it actually goes to market, but they know it's going there, they contact the municipality and say, okay, you are, this property is up for sale, we're letting you know, you have the first option to buy it, okay? Now, there are a couple of opportunities here. I am not familiar enough with these to make a recommendation or not, but I made sure it was on there so you would be able to see it in writing if you want to look at it down the road. So for example, Bank of America has a thing that you can, opt into where if that's one of their properties, and Bank of America is, if not the biggest, one of the biggest mortgage lenders in the nation, they will announce to the municipality before it goes on the market that this particular property is coming up. So one of the options there. Then there's another program, which again, I've never heard of, but I think this is relatively new unless someone here is familiar with them. They're called the National Community Stabilization Trust, and they have this thing that's got First Look program, and it works with local governments and state governments to make sure that all of the transfers of buildings and properties from one financial institution to another are done appropriately. So again, not real familiar with it, but it did show up in some of the best practices that I was looking at, and so it might be worth a look into. Again, part of the issue is letting the community know when a purchase is going to, or a sale, purchase, or transfer is going to be made. So it's key to at least be aware of what's going on. You guys don't have a land bank here, do you? No? A land bank is basically an opportunity to hold a property that is up for sale until the community has the opportunity to find a responsible buyer. Now, this usually works best, which is pretty significant in most communities today, where supply exceeds demand. And I am again not recommending this wholeheartedly because this is also something that's new to me, but it really seems to show up quite a bit in smaller communities throughout the nation. So I would suggest that if you are looking for alternative ways to deal with existing properties, that you do look into land banks. And basically they are a government authorized public authority. And I'm not quite sure how that transfer happens initially, but it might very well be that some of the things we're going to talk about later in this program, where property is actually received by the city, this might be where that land, or that, the land bank comes into play. So rather than the city take it on at that moment, it's put into this trust. The bank then maintains the building or the property so that it gives the community a little bit of time to find an appropriate buyer, as opposed to having to run out and get one right away and taking whoever has the first dollar amount. So again, you might want to check into this. Again, you'll see I got down here, ask the city attorney before you even consider this, because it is not something I'm wholly familiar with, but it sure seems to be pretty much commonplace in both large and small communities throughout. So definitely worth looking into. Okay, so if you have foreclosed properties, which I'm assuming you probably don't have a lot of, because if you did, you'd probably be able to figure out a way to get them. But the first thing that happens is if you have a property where you know it's going into foreclosure, before that goes into foreclosure, you want to convince the landowner to donate it. All right? Yeah, I'm sure you're thinking, oh yeah, that's going to happen. But actually, there might be some great advantage to a landowner who owns that property, sees absolutely no profitable value, and it might be because it's ready to be demolished. Okay, but there are all kinds of opportunities with that. Contact them. Remember, you always have to know as best you can who owns those properties, and the community needs to be in touch with them on a regular basis. When we move forward in the presentation, you'll see why and how you're going to be able to do that. But the key is, if it's going to go into foreclosure, try to talk them into donating the land. And you can, use that whole argument of you're never going to get your investment back, but if you donate before foreclosure, then you might be able to get a little bit of, deductions here and there that will help ease the loss of the investment. Again, taxes change every year. Don't ever make these choices or ask someone to donate without talking to your city attorney first. But the key is a lot of times when a property owner, particularly the commercial property, when they're looking to go into foreclosure, they will file foreclosure and then walk away. And then not even finish the foreclosure process. That's a mess. That is a huge mess. So anytime somebody's going into foreclosure or you think they are, try to get them to donate the building to the community. Plan first, talk to the city attorney first, and clearly you want to clear this with your councils, your boards, your mayors, your presidents, whomever first. But if you think that that's a doable process for you, that's what you want to do. And this is where that land bank comes in. Because now you've got a donated foreclosed property, and you're just probably not ready to deal with it as of yet. So if you can have a kind of a third party that has the authority to do all the things that need to be done, that's where you want to go with it. I already kind of mentioned this, but a lot of times when foreclosures, people walk away from foreclosures, the building does what the old bank building did. And then who's responsible for cleanup? Certainly not the current owner. Well, legally they should be, but you're going to leave it like that? You probably have, at least I've seen them already, at least one or two kids in town, and that's really not what you want to do. If everybody here was over the age of majority, then yeah, maybe everyone would stay out of it. But I think there's a bar somewhere down the road, so probably not a real good idea to leave it like it is. But one of the advantages to bringing on this donation or to trying to step in during the foreclosure process or before it gets to foreclosure is that even though you're taking on costs of demolition if need be, or figuring out what to do with that property, is that the blight caused by that particular piece of property can be dealt with immediately or as quickly as you are ready to have it dealt with, not having to wait for the foreclosure process to go through. So you really want to put this on your list of things to consider, but don't do it without a plan. Okay, so what kinds of things can you do? Well, I'm glad to see that we have some of the local government officials here because almost every one of these requires that the local governments dealing with these communities make some kinds of decisions. Again, not every one of these is going to be right for these your communities. Not every one of these do we, even in the state of Illinois, I'm not sure of this, but not all of them do we have the legal authority to do. So again, suggestions, ideas, if they prompt new and different ideas, so much the better. But again, don't do anything without going through all the processes and most importantly, talking to your attorney. So these are the things we're going to talk about. Holding property owners accountable, pursuing vigilant and proactive enforcement. Do you guys have any enforcement here in Lena? I mean, in Lanark for any of your zoning codes?
Never really done very much, of course.
That's one of the biggest problems that you're facing. You want to develop and pass appropriate ordinances if you don't have any. And then there's a couple of opportunities for you to look to actual residents, many of you, for help in this process. So we're going to really talk a lot about how do you hold property owners accountable. Now, you notice it doesn't say absentee property owners because this applies to everybody. However, the minute you are an absentee property owner, your ordinances can look a little different. Again, check with your city attorney to make sure that you can do that, but that's one of the things that many communities are doing. And they're saying absentee owners have a different level of responsibility than local people do. But as far as being up to code, as far as making sure that you're paying your taxes, all of those things apply to everybody. But you'll see some interesting options that will come up throughout this part of the presentation. So how do you hold them accountable? We're going to talk a little bit later about incentives for absentee property owners to actually want to do the kinds of things that need to be done. We're going to talk about disincentives that basically say, you know, if you don't comply, there are actually going to be penalties. And then those penalties will help to discourage deterioration and reduce the need to nuisance properties, meaning to create all kinds of city or municipal responsibility for those properties. Okay. So the very first thing, if you don't already have them, is you want to start looking at ordinances that actually spell out maintenance responsibilities. Now you probably have some, you probably want to relook at them. There are ordinances available online. You can call other communities who have done these kinds of things. You can tailor them to your community. Urbana-Champaign, it's Champaign I think that has these, one or the other above. Their ordinances have the word students in them everywhere because they are a heavily, student population. So you are able to make those kinds of changes that apply specifically to your community, if indeed such a thing is necessary or applies. Again, just because you're writing it into an ordinance doesn't mean you have legal authority to do that, but there's no reason that you can't start looking into what are the needs for the community in terms of particularly the business district. Because your business district is, you have one bright shining star in your business district as far as businesses go, and that is you have a grocery store, because most small communities do not anymore. They are almost all gone. So that is a huge, huge selling point. I stood outside because I thought I was supposed to be at 106, what would that be, north? I thought I was supposed to be at I thought I was at 106 south. I knew the Heritage Center was here, but for some reason I kept thinking that was south. So I'm standing in front of that door, which meant I was directly across from that grocery store. I cannot count the number of people who drove up, ran in, got back in their vehicles, and drove off. Every time somebody does that, even if they're only coming for a quart of milk, if you have businesses in these places, they notice them and they come back. And people like, regardless of what reality happens, they like to shop local when they know there's still some value in shopping local. So if you do fill all these storefronts with stores, the first thing you want to do is always fill them with retail as much as you can. Try to kick your services if you could rent those spaces or sell those spaces. As much as you're going to get complaints from the real estate guys, maybe even from the city attorney, you want to kick them upstairs, and I'll tell you why. Because if you don't already know, at least for right now, when they pay, the state of Illinois kicks back 1 cent on every retail sales tax dollar that's collected in your community. 1 cent of every retail tax dollar. That's 16% of the real estate, or the retail sales tax that's collected comes back to you. And that's one of the ways that your city or municipality gets to really continue to move forward. So the more retail you put in your first floors, in your storefronts, the better off you are. Now some of them you really don't want. You could kick your city attorney upstairs, but you probably don't want to kick your real estate upstairs, because while they don't sell directly, if they, in that storefront, what they sell brings new taxes into the community. So you don't want to have to worry about that. But the idea is you want to really spell out what your maintenance responsibilities should be if you are an owner of property in this town. And so you want to take a look at what you have, take a look at what problems you have, and then decide what you need to put in your ordinances. And of course you got to get them passed, and you make sure they're legal, in order to make the changes that need to be changed. When you have non-compliance, particularly it happens when you're absentee, you have to increase the penalties. One of the biggest problems is nobody goes after absentee landowners. And one of the reasons why people don't go after absentee landowners is because they don't even really know who they are or how to reach them. So we're going to, again, add in some places as we move forward here as to how you can make that happen. Now, notice in this one, you have to establish a timeline to bring a property into compliance with whatever ordinances your community is now going to have, right? But you notice it says buyers and sellers. Because you don't want that seller to say, I'm just gonna sell this building and get out from under it. Especially if that seller is your absentee landowner. So you wanna make sure that there has to be a timeline that both buyers and sellers have to agree to in order for the sale to go through. And you can do that. Again, check with your city attorney for how to make that happen. But you can put these kinds of, maybe not this specific one, but these kinds of constraints on the sale of property in your community. Thing you want to remember, if you've ever read the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments to the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment is almost all about property, however you want to read it. It is almost all about property and due process. So you have to remember that the right to private property in this nation is huge. We wrote it into our Constitution in the Bill of Rights part of it, which is the biggie part, okay? And then we wrote the 14th Amendment to make sure that what once applied only to the federal government now applies to all other governments in the nation. So what that means is you can't deprive somebody of property. And if you want to talk about eminent domain, we'll get there at the end. You can't deprive someone of property without A, due process, and B, fair compensation. But you can annoy them enough that they want out of your community and they are willing to sell. And the only way you can do that is if you enforce whatever ordinances you can put into play with the legal authority to do so. And agreement by a bunch of people, and we'll talk about them in a little while as well. If you do that, you will annoy these people so much that they'll either sell for a lower rate, they'll walk away from the building, they'll donate it, whatever it is that you can negotiate with them, you will have an easier time of doing it if you actually put in ordinances, make sure there are significant penalties, and that you establish, whenever there's a sale, that you establish the timeline for both buyers and sellers to meet compliance. So keep all those things in mind. We're going to keep going. Now, one of the other things you want to think about is that not all properties are equal. Housing properties are much different than business properties. Business properties that have apartments on the top are different than simple, straightforward business, commercial properties. So you really don't want to blanket anything when you are doing any kind of ordinance. You have to give this a lot of consideration. You don't just say, oh, I like this ordinance that, Lena has or Freeport has, because what they have may not work for your community. It may not even work for their communities. So you really want to think about where you're at now, where you want to be, and what unintended consequences are going to happen from whatever policy choice you make. And again, don't know how to stress this, but you can do all the ordinances you want. If you do not enforce those ordinances, you will never, ever affect any change. So that's one of the consequences of putting in ordinances. You have to be willing, and this means everybody in the community, you have to be willing to pay the price of having maintenance and enforcement. But we'll talk about how you might get around that in a bit. And so if you don't have a code that currently exists, you need one. You absolutely need one. But if you have zoning, then you probably have some form of code. You just want to check that out, see what it is, and see how you can use it. And again, you gotta enforce that code. And here's one of the ways to do it. You charge the cost of inspection visits after whatever you legally require from your own community as an inspection to the property owner. Because if you have to come out there again because they haven't complied within a reasonable period of time, that cost is on them. Again, can't guarantee you're going to be able to collect it, but you might be able to. Right? So you start to think about these kinds of things. These sorts of things are costly. You want to recoup those costs. And so you put them on the back of the property owners who are not complying. You make sure that those fines are significant. If you're fining $20, you can't even get them into court for non-payment. So you really want to think about, now you don't want to do millions of dollars either, because you want to make sure that someone's going to be willing to buy whatever property is available in your community. But you want to look at more than just a slap on the wrist, or it's not worth having any of those ordinances. Because you need to gain the attention of that owner. You just absolutely have to bring them, if not physically, then legally or financially into this community. Because think about it, if somebody owns here and the way their ownership is, they're renting that piece of property out, whether it's a business or a house or an apartment on top of a business, where's that money going? It's wherever that absentee person lives. That money is not staying locally. So, and that's fine, because not every building is going to be able to be purchased by people locally, especially in this type of economic situation. So you really want to not kill the opportunity to have every single property purchased and owned and running and occupied, but you really want to encourage local. I mean, I think I'll probably get that part. So if you can't have someone be local, you want to gain their attention. The first thing you want to do, and you can do this by ordinance, and so far as I know, there is no Illinois statute that would even come close to prohibiting this one, because I know that many communities in Illinois are doing this, is you require property owners to register. And if that property is transferred in any way, that registration must be updated immediately. And there are penalties for not registering. So you can start to see how things are going to add up. Not just money, you know, the fines and that sort of thing, but the costs related to being an absentee owner will increase. Right? So you have to think about that. If you are an absentee owner, and this is done in some Illinois communities, if you are going to do that and be an absentee owner, you can require that that absentee owner have a local agent responsible for that property. Now, and I'm pretty sure in Illinois now you can do this, but again, question for your city attorney, and that is that in the ordinance it says local agents are to be considered just like the owner in terms of legal responsibility for that property. In some states, they are two separate entities. Basically, you got a local manager, and then you got your property owner. The manager is not responsible for the property if the owner is not living up to their standards, you know, the community standards. Now, and I'm fairly sure Illinois now has this on the books, but again, check, to make that local agent equally responsible in a legal sense starts to change that picture about what happens to that building, doesn't it? Okay, so think in those terms. You want banks to require registration of foreclosed property so that you know what's going on in that foreclosure area, in that arena. And here is another thing that I found again today. You should be able to read it on your list, right? I couldn't fit it all the way in here. But there's an association where if you don't want to do the paperwork to register all foreclosed properties, there's this Mortgage Bankers Association mortgage electronic registration system that will do it for you. I assume there's a fee. But it's certainly worth looking into if you don't have the local resource or capacity to do the paperwork that would be required to register all foreclosures. So take a look into that, see what those costs are, see if one outweighs the other. Then you want to look at this one. In addition to passing ordinances that impose appropriate but not little teeny fines for non-compliance, you want to consider criminal penalties. Unless they do something really bad, we're not talking felony here, we're talking misdemeanor. But misdemeanor requires you to show up in court, it requires you to pay, it requires a lot more things than you just saying, you're not up to code and we're going to fine you $50. So start to look into these opportunities and see what other things you can do. And our state does not have a piece of legislation that requires this, but many states do. So, you guys are members of IML, they may have a different reason for not lobbying the state, but IML is a lobbying, Illinois Municipal League is a lobbying organization. See where they stand on this, see if they're trying to get this done. If not, you might consider just going ahead and lobbying through your local legislators to see if this is something you can get statewide. The minute it goes statewide, then local governments have a much easier time in enacting and enforcing these kinds of things. Okay. Here's one of the biggest problems that people have. Somebody buys a building, and really the community, the municipality may not know what's wrong with it. Was it, somebody, I think I was standing out in the street talking to somebody, I don't remember who it was today, talking about how what they thought was in the building that crumbled was, they were told was in there in terms of safety and protection and construction was not the case. Well, you get to find that out when the building crumbles down, right? So part of what you need to do is to consider local ordinances that really put obligations to bring something up to code in a very specified timeline. Now, rapidly doesn't mean 6 weeks. I mean, unless all it is you have to, replace the windows or something along those lines. It's very easy. And we're going to talk more about that in a second as well. One of the other things you might want to do is you can say, if you're buying as an absentee owner, you have this timeline to fit in all of the things that need to happen in order to bring this building up to code. If you have a local buyer, you might be able to use that Cornerstone nonprofit to assist that local buyer in bringing that up to code in that time frame. There's a lot of people may say, I can't buy that building because I might be able to afford the down payment, I might be able to afford the monthly mortgage, but I am not going to be able to do all of that, start my business, and bring this up to code at the same time. So if you have a nonprofit, it's usually a great way to do this, but the community itself can provide a little bit of funding. You really want to weigh what are the costs of not having businesses in your downtown, to have to pay for either demolition or cleanup, to have to fight any kind of legal battles, and giving somebody some money or making money available even as a no interest or low interest loan to get a building up to the code that the community requires. If that person is local, that is going to increase local interest in purchasing. For people who, say they might want to purchase a building or open a business, but see too many obstacles in their way. I mean, you have some beautiful buildings down here, but I imagine most of them need a lot of work. So you have to figure out ways that you can help people locally to do that. Again, you really have to, I know I'm saying this over and over, but if you do not enforce the laws you put into place, they're useless, and you're going to stay with what you have right now, or it will get worse. Remember I said earlier you're going to have to coordinate with a lot of people? Well, here's one of those places you have to coordinate. If you push to pass ordinances and you push to get enforcement done, you have to work with Mr. Mitchell, you have to work with the prosecuting attorneys in the area, you got to work with the judges in the area to make sure that they don't let your hard work at creating creating ordinances and going through and paying for enforcement or figuring out ways to charge that enforcement cost back, that you're not losing that time and effort because the people above you are like, well, every other time we do anything like this, we just blow it off, it's not a big deal. You have to make sure that everybody in that process is on board with you, or again, enforcement isn't going to go very far. If you do not have someone everywhere up in that process who's going to agree with you. Now, you have vacant properties here, almost every community does. Like I said, nobody wants to open a business next to an empty storefront because one of the ways people get business is if somebody's coming in the storefront next door to them, they're going to walk down at some point in time to your door. So you really want to make sure that you can fill as many as you can. So vacant properties, and this includes, again, apartments and housing and everything else, requires special kinds of things in your ordinances. And here's a couple of things that I think will really be helpful. First of all, you have to have a clear plan from the owner or a buyer if the process is underway to meet your obligations you now put into your ordinances. So in other words, every vacant property now has to have a written plan with which you will expect compliance, recognizing that if you've ever worked in any kind of building industry, you know nothing ever goes as planned, but at least you have this plan and that they will be expected to follow it. You've got to have those timelines in place. And again, you got to have some flexibility, but if your flexibility is, yes, you have to get this done, and that's as far as you go, who's really going to go ahead and do that? Unless they're really serious about helping the community. Which again, you may get lucky and have people who will do that. This I find really intriguing. You can charge owners fees, but you have to have a real reason why you're doing that. So in addition, if you have to do multiple inspections, you charge them a fee for that additional or all those additional inspections. When you have vacant properties in a community, it costs your municipality to do certain kinds of things. Well, figure out what those things are, add up those things, and do that in a yearly fee. Now, if you were getting hit with all of these different kinds of fees, pretty soon you're going to, and requirements to register, to have timelines, to bring things up to code within those timelines, to do this, that, or the other thing, you're really starting to think this is more hassle than it's worth. And so you're starting at least to get these owners on the road to thinking, I don't really want to own a building in Lanark because they got too much stuff to go with it. You can require specifically owners that have vacant properties, they must register as a vacant property, and then here you can absolutely require they obtain a local agent. And that's a safety issue, which is one of the reasons why here you can, as far as I understand the state of Illinois, any state, you can require that property owners, when the property is vacant, must obtain a local agent for safety reasons. And by local agent, that's someone to manage the property, make sure everything goes on correctly. You can require that there's guarantees, and you can actually assess fees, and you can assess upfront monies to make sure that these things happen. Now again, I'm not sure about what happens in Illinois, but what you need to do is to start again, thinking about how do you appropriately, it's not like you're saying, okay, if you don't live in Lanark, we're going to charge you $500,000 a year to own a property, because they're just going to, you try to take that to court, and you're going to lose, and look at all the court costs that are going to, apply for that. Although you keep Mr. Mitchell very busy at doing that, I suppose. So you really want to look at, again, what those options are. You can require, absolutely, that vacant property owners carry liability insurance. Full enough to cover all costs on that property. Okay? Liability insurance you can require. Now, here's something, again, that I've heard of, but I'm not 100% sure of how you put one together. But this is the kind of thing that if you guys are interested, it's a sort of thing that Extension and some of the other resources here locally, we can find out what this would take. Communities are establishing a housing court. Now, I find that intriguing. I think the state of Illinois, unless they have explicitly outlawed it, and I haven't been able to find that yet, would be really amenable to this because we have courts for everything. The Illinois, this is, I have a curriculum we do for high schools and now younger kids on Illinois local government. Illinois, most unique local government structure in the entire nation. We have more local governments entities, not just people, more local government entities than any other state in the union. Pennsylvania is our next closest competitor, and we have 3,000 more local governments, not officials, more local governments than Pennsylvania does. Okay? So we really love local government. We have 120,000 local government officials. Most of them are people like me. I sit on a planning commission, I don't get paid, you know, it's a once a month thing, but I'm counted in those numbers. So it's both elected and appointed. This is the kind of thing, unless again it's expressively prohibited, and I have not been able to find that I think Illinois would love. I'm thinking for something like this though, you probably not want to have it in the county. You might want to do something where multiple counties get together and you have one regionally. And what they basically do is they handle all issues dealing with housing and properties and commercial properties. So you can look at that. And you can get a receiver to rehabilitate. I gotta read this correctly because this is, you know, kind of legal stuff here. You can authorize a receiver to rehabilitate or demolish a property when the owner of a dilapidated building is unresponsive. And that receiver is appointed by the court. So one of the advantages of having, you know, a property court or whatever they would call it in those terms, is that they would be very familiar with those kinds of issues and laws and know what would constitute unresponsive. If you try to take it to another court, I'm not sure whether or not you would get that same kind of responsiveness, but it certainly is worth checking out. I don't know of any place in Illinois that has a receiver that would then take, receiver meaning an entity, maybe like Cornerstone again, who, when this happens, where a property owner who's absent, or even local, but unresponsive to the fines and the, you know, if you charge them with a misdemeanor and they're completely unresponsive to any of the bringing up to code, then the court can say, we're putting this into receivership. And that receivership, the receiver would be Cornerstone, or the receiver would be, you know, somebody else who will guarantee to come in, fix the place or demolish it as needed, and then the legal situation starts, that all those wheels start turning and that property winds up being fully in receivership, and the property owner is basically, you know, it's like putting a lien on the property and then losing, you know, the case of the property goes where it's supposed to go. This is not eminent domain. This is a very different thing. And again, I don't know of any community in Illinois who does it, so there may be some kind of prohibition or something that wouldn't allow that to happen. But, and again, you know, you had to collapse the building, so I wasn't rushing out to find out all these little things. When we first started this, I've only been doing this for a couple of days. So I'm going to try to find that out because I think this program is probably going to be helpful to other communities as well. So I really want to start looking into what Illinois would allow for this. Okay, you can actually, and again, this is communities are doing this, not sure who's doing it in Illinois. You can hold lenders responsible for maintaining property and making sure that the process of sale is being responsible. So it's not like one family member selling it to another family member to kind of get out from under whatever problems they have as the owner. That is not necessarily a responsible process. And then the lender becomes somewhat responsible for this as well, or at least to report it. And again, sometimes it's just having the information that you need to really know what's going on. Okay, this is my favorite. You can raise property taxes on, and again, check through Illinois, you can raise property taxes on vacant properties. This, I'm assuming, would be a county thing, would have to be done, but check this out. Louisville, Kentucky, vacant properties of more than a year as long as they are unsafe. Because sometimes you just can't rent a property, you know. You can't find a store to come in, and it may not be you, the property owner's fault. But if the building is unsafe and it is vacant and no work has been done to ensure safety in that property, Louisville does it 3 times the normal tax. Okay, which basically means you're going to go after those people a lot more quickly when they start missing tax payments. Okay, Chicago requires that owners of, now think about your neighbors, okay? That owners of, this is Chicago, so you know you can do that here. Owners of vacant properties must post in a conspicuous place a sign with their name, address, and phone number. so that the city and any resident who walks by gets that contact information. Now, what do you think is gonna happen if the building next door to where you work or where you live is vacant, and not just for a week or two? I mean, clearly this has to have a period of time associated with it. Aren't you gonna start calling those people? And you realize every time they change their phone numbers, they're legally bound to change the sign. Okay, because it has to be an ability to contact those owners. So you can see, like I said, this problem is international. It's international. Usually you find it in two places. You either find it in places in urban centers where a lot of minorities live. In other words, not a lot of political power. And the property values are pretty low, so you can buy in, collect rents, and even if the people move out and stiff you for a month or 3 months, it doesn't really matter. You're not putting anything into that building. So anything you get is pretty much gravy towards that investment price that you had, which was probably, maybe $13,000, $14,000 for an urban property, like a tree flat, okay? And where else? Rural America, or small town America, like this. Okay, and it's happening on farms. If any of you are farmers, you're finding absentee farm owners, which are causing the same kinds of problems, but they have different solutions. So anything you can do to hold those property owners accountable, help. Remember I said citizens can do that? One of the best ways, and I know they hate to do this, in terms of the city saying, oh yeah, please contact me whenever you see a problem. Because you know what? Your city council persons or your board members or your mayors or your presidents, they do not want to be called at 3 o'clock in the morning because there is some kind of furry thing with lights glowing in their eyes walking around an empty building and you're panic stricken. So there are a couple of opportunities for you to deal with this, especially if you live next door. And part of that is, if you don't have an individual who is already designated as the contact person, set up a hotline. Yeah, there's going to be a small cost associated with it, but the one thing is, the minute you set up a hotline, you had better be willing to respond to it. Because if you just give a place for people to call and you are not being responsive to that, you are really killing your PR with your residents. And that's not something you want, especially if you're in an elected position. And today, a lot of people use social media. Major urban centers, you get a pothole, you pick out your cell phone, you go into the little app that says I'm reporting something on my community, and wham, it reports the place, the depth of it, whatever it is that's the problem. There's a place to report it. Those apps are not easy to make, but they're also not that difficult, nor are they that expensive. So if you want to really impress people in your community, especially, I notice you guys have a lot of young people in this community, more than a lot that are around in the area. I would say you really want to think about using social media, or again, a hotline that records, because you're not going to have everybody working social media in the community. But every time you offer something to your residents, you have got to be responsible. Now we do have a few incentives. So if somebody is moving in, and you might even consider this, I wouldn't consider your downtown, even though I know you have a crumbled building, blighted. I think it's on that place where it can go either direction. You have some beautiful buildings here. You've got a wonderful downtown. You still have that grocery store. You have opportunity. You really, really do. You have great opportunity to build something here. And you are on an amazing road. People are coming and going up through this road all the time. So for you to be able to struggle to build back that downtown is really a goal that I would like to encourage for you to do that. So maybe what you look for are, how do we don't really want to call it a distressed area, but maybe you do create some sort of tax incentive for people who are willing to come in and that live here preferably to purchase some of the property here, or even to rent it and bring business in. If you are going to do that, and if you're going to use a term, in this case distressed area, you had better define that term perfectly before any ordinance is created. Because, again, $50.2 million. We all love the people in our community, but sometimes they surprise us. So you really don't want someone in a position to say, oh yeah, okay, we're gonna count that as distress and give a tax, some kind of tax incentive to someone because they're a friend or a relative or a friend of a friend. So we really have to be careful. Again, it's not, communities aren't run today like they used to be even 20 years ago, where a handshake meant everything. Now, we're still such a litigious society that you never know when you're going to get hurt. So the key is you have to protect your community. Look at what your rehab code is, your current code for bringing buildings up to code. In the city of Chicago, it's fascinating. I'm Chicago born and bred, so one of the things that I learned when my mother used to rehab houses when I was a kid is if you break into a wall to do one thing in that electric, you have to bring the entire electric in the building up to code. Okay? Now, there's reasons why Chicago does this. Well, for one thing, they get money because, the permitting and all of the costs associated with that. Plus, they improve the building. But they had a fire in the 1870s that really changed a lot of the kinds of building codes in Chicago. You probably don't really need to go that direction. You may have a code that's too lenient right now. You may have a code that's too strict. You really want to take a look at what are those minimums that you're going to accept. And those minimums have better be pretty healthy and certainly safe-wise. So that anybody in the community who's willing to buy a building could bring that building up to code without a huge expense. Because that is a pretty big deal. And if you're living in the community, you probably want to make sure that building is up to code. If you're not, you don't care because you're not living there. So you really want to think about that. Again, I want to stress that these practices have worked for a lot of communities. There are also a lot of opportunities that people took that didn't, that backfired on them. So if you're going to try any of these, again, you can let myself know. I'm sure that you guys are Highland here, right? Okay, so there's probably people at Highland, if you don't want to work with Extension, that might be able to help you research ordinances. I put out a call this morning to my colleagues across the state, and that's how I got the Urbana one, and I think one came in right before I came in here today. So they have ordinances that are already written throughout the state. You can find pretty much anything you want online. And if not, once you get those ordinances, call the cities and say, I really want to know how this worked for you and what kinds of things that you ran into. If you haven't ever called another community to ask them how they do things or how something worked or didn't work for them, you will be extraordinarily surprised about, as long as there's no legal issue resolved or as part of it, how much they would love to tell you about their community. So if you find something, call them, have a conversation. Now, again, in order to avoid these pitfalls, you want to plan, you want to check with your attorney, and then you have to ensure buy-in by those people who are going to be responsible for enforcement. So that is, do you have someone local who's going to be able to tell when there is a violation? Then do you have a process in place, and who's responsible for the process to get that violation to the owner and keep track of all of the process and hopefully getting paid for that violation? And then when non-compliance becomes an issue, is your city attorney, your prosecuting attorney, and your judges, are they on board? And that might simply mean having a conversation with them, or 6 conversations with them. And as you bring one, on board, you bring, let's say you bring Mr. Mitchell on board first. When you go to the prosecuting attorneys, you bring him with, or let him go, whichever you guys want to do. Every time you bring in a new person or a new group, you bring them with to the next group. Because once people see that there is support in the process below where they sit, they're much more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt and consider what issues you have. All right, so do you have the resources? That's first and foremost. If you do not or are not willing to get the resources to enforce code and walk through those violation processes, don't do it. Because you're just going to be spinning your wheels and frustrating yourselves. That might mean that there is another person you have to put on staff. It might mean you have to contract with existing people who inspectors, those kinds of things. Whatever it is, if you're going to do it though, make sure that you check out whoever it is that you put on in this position or contract with, because you want to make sure you get your money's worth, especially the contract. Contracting is pretty expensive. Not as expensive as hiring somebody on permanently. First question you always ask when you have a new idea, particularly for an ordinance, is you got to go to Mr. Mitchell and say, we have the legal authority to do this? And you may not get an answer from him for a few weeks on this, because they're real easy, right? You just call up somebody, there's like a 1-800, know the answer, you call them up. It's amazing. I mean, think about this. We have 120,000 local government officials in the state. You can't even imagine how many laws we have in the book. So everybody wants to do something a little differently. So unless your question is exactly answered clearly, like, okay, yes, if Lanark calls with this question, they have legal authority, it isn't going to be an overnight answer, unless somebody else has already done it. Okay, so recognize, again, not overnight, but you don't necessarily want things that could get you, some really negative consequences down the road to be in overnight. The other thing, again, I already talked about cost of sort of, bringing in all of this enforcement kind of stuff. The other thing is, what kind of bureaucracy do you have locally? Usually in a town this size, that's not a big issue. In larger communities, it does become pretty major. Okay, so again, there are pitfalls. You want to avoid them. And really what that is planning and talking and really trying to think out what those consequences are. All right, now, I've just given you a whole bunch. There are more. I've just given you a whole bunch of ways to handle absentee landowners in your community, and some that, again, you get something from here and it sparks a different idea and you find that will work for Lanark better than anything I've suggested. You go through, you do all that. Now, everything, you guys are great, you listen to me, and then you're going to call it the Feinberg ordinances, and the world's going to be great, and all of these buildings. Okay, nothing happens. I know you've all heard this term. I know you all probably walk up and down, whether it's the street you live on or this street out here, and you say to yourself, why are we not doing this? Especially since, I forget how many years ago, there was a Supreme Court case that said eminent domain can be used in certain cases where it is for the economic benefit of the community. So you take a look and you think, that place and that place and that place is owned by somebody who's not keeping it up. Why can't the city just absorb it? Now, I told you a little bit before, I used to work for, I was the ran community development for the city of Indianapolis. We got a huge grant from the federal government in this thing called the home ownership zone. And there were only 2 grants awarded, and we got 2/3 of the grant. The other people got 1/3. We had all this money. We had this huge neighborhood that was truly blighted, and we wanted to do mixed housing, which means we want people who were on Section 8 all the way to people who have a lot of money, 6-7 figures in their salary. And believe me, there are plenty of them in Indianapolis as well. Great plans for this thing, but we had 3 buildings. Now this is before the Supreme Court said you could take it for economic development. We had 3 they were one-time single-family homes, but now we're multi-family, multi-people living in there. They were vacant, and so, remember, big major urban center, they had drug dealers living in them. They weren't paying to live there, they were just basically squatting. So you'd think we'd be able to say, we're going to take the police over there, we're going to pull these guys out. Obviously, the landowner's not doing anything with it. We're going to do eminent domain, take these 3 buildings. Took us 3 years. 3 years. Now again, this is before the case went through the Supreme Court, but you can only do economic development using eminent domain under certain circumstances. But it is an option, and it's one that if anybody ever considers it, you better have a long conversation with Mr. Mitchell and about 6 other attorneys to find out exactly what it's going to take Because what you don't want to do, again, is to have this come back and bite you. All right, so it's a great idea. Everybody knows the phrase. Most people understand that the court said something about it a long time ago, somewhere in the 2000, I don't remember what it was, 2003, 2005, whatever. Yeah, not a real good thing. Plus, I gotta tell you, it's not real good for PR in your community to just go in and say, we're gonna take that building. Because then you gotta wonder, well, if they're gonna take this building without basic strengthened due process, you know, what, maybe they can take mine. So it's really, you don't want to get that kind of thoughts going through the people in your community. But it is absolutely an option to use. It's just very difficult, time consuming, and has way too many consequences, I think, to come back. But when safety is an issue, that should be something you should consider. Okay. We just did an hour and 15 minutes, a whole bunch of opportunity or alternatives for dealing with absentee landlord. So now I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions about this sort of thing? Can't believe you're all still awake. Any other questions at all about downtown revitalization, that sort of thing?
Yeah. We were going to talk about how to find some of these absentee.
Okay, this is how you got to do it. You have to do it through enforced registration. Remember, non-compliance leads to other steps you can take.
But what if you don't even know who they are to register them?
Okay, the way that and this is what I did. I called a community, not Wooddale, I can't remember what it was. It's a burb in Chicago. We did this in 1990. And they said the biggest problem they had was those first 5 years in getting just the kind of people getting a hold of them. But they said that because it was part of their ordinances, they were actually given more opportunity through the mortgage holders. And they weren't able to get them the numbers directly, the information directly from the way I understood it. And you have to understand, the person I spoke to was not someone who was there 22 years ago when they did this. But apparently they were able to utilize the mortgage holders to get to them. Not get the information, but to get to them and serve notice. Mm-hmm. Now, I would assume that if you're talking about houses, you probably have a much more difficult time doing this. But if it's a commercial property, then there's registration of that property through the state. And maybe that's one of the ways that if there's an ordinance in place, I suspect without an ordinance, you're not going to get the information. But with an ordinance, that's the way that this woman made it sound, was that they had a little bit of teeth to go to.
So with the ordinance, you have more teeth?
That's what her
So you
thought
almost need
was.
to create that ordinance first, and then maybe for the future, you deal with it.
Yeah, and then anytime there's a sale, the lender must make sure that because you would put that in there. That's why the lender has to register vacant or properties that are in transference. So you really want to look at how you can set those ordinances up that without being, again, too cumbersome to either buyer or seller, or the lender for that matter, but enough to just get you that piece, that registration piece. But
So the registration is to the city?
yes.
To whom is it?
Yeah, well, and I don't know, maybe it might be better to do it through county. But I would say the city is where you really want to go. And I do know that this was started, Woodside, I think it is, which is a small community on the outskirts of Chicago in the burbs. And apparently they did this in 1990. Within a few years, it was hugely successful. And then everybody and their brother started calling them and saying, how did you do this? So I will be sure I connect and make sure that it is Woodside. And I'm happy if you guys want to take one of my cards and email me with any questions you have. I can track these things down for you and get that information.
Just even some sample ordinances or?
Yeah. Yeah, because that's the key. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly.
But you do want to make sure that any ordinance you're going to propose gets cleared first. Because that's something a lot of communities don't do. They just go ahead and put it before the council and then they pay the price afterwards. Yeah.
How about, is there a way to legally go in and check the remaining buildings that are involved with that?
You said
owner?
that magic word, so I don't answer.
That owner? Or that family?
You're checking the safety of the building? Is that
Yes,
what you're
yes,
concerned
the
about?
safety.
The whole
We're
block,
gonna
is
take
the
a
whole
look
block
at it.
gonna fall into a big hole, or what?
Well, I don't think the whole block's gonna fall in a big hole. There are some provisions to go in, a nuisance statute, which doesn't just deal with nuisances, that you can go in and inspect. The city's done that a couple of times.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but they did have an engineer come out and look at those buildings, and they've
Yeah.
got a report.
Yeah, that's already, that was done on those two buildings. It was done on the Shumway building.
And from what I remember of the report, the building that didn't fall is the worst one of the two.
You mean the next one?
The one that's attached
Well,
to
how
our
about-
building.
That's worse, that, yeah. Next.
As I remember the report reading, that was worse than the one that fell, so.
How about up the block further?
Well, I don't know, our building is pretty good, pretty sound, but I don't know about the rest.
Because I
The
know that
Shears.
at one time the Shears building was leaking water so bad. And,
Yeah.
I'm told by that owner that that has a roof, that they put a roof on that.
oh, good.
Yeah. I mean, the upstairs doesn't look good, but he says that
As long as it's
the
not
roof,
leaking.
yeah, that they put a roof on it.
Yeah.
You keep saying and mentioning fines. What is a number that you're throwing out there?
You know, I wouldn't, and I'll tell you why, because this community, for example, is very different from the city of Indianapolis in terms of what's both the price of the place and what's affordable. What you want to do is look at like communities like yours and see where there are fines, what those fines are. But remember, non-compliance in a house that's owned by someone else and rented, non-compliance in the business with apartments, non-compliance in the business only, those kinds of things should all be different. And you may, maybe you even do a sliding scale where your first violation is X dollars, your second violation or your non-compliance with that original violation is then this many dollars, and you take a look at that. So you could do a structure in any way you want, and maybe you don't want to do a burden. Maybe there isn't enough people locally, or you don't feel comfortable that there's enough people locally to buy what you have. Then what you really don't want to do is get them so annoyed that they will sell. What you want them to do is to come into compliance. And so there's a variety of ways you would do that too. So you guys really have to decide what your community is looking at. But one thing I would definitely do is I would recoup all costs beyond normal inspection. So if you do a walk down the street inspection, once a year, or you have some kind of, I don't know what the laws are here about the commercial building inspections, but if you do those and you do them normally, then the city needs to absorb that cost. But if you are going back to a building because of non-compliance or because there was an issue you couldn't get in and that wasn't the city's fault, then you attach a fee to that. And those are the kinds of things where you're actually recouping the cost of whatever it's costing you to go out and do these things. And that's key. That to me is the number one thing that you got to get back, because then the fines are just going to, especially if you can get them registered or at least find out who they are, then that begins to change your world. It's not an overnight process. It's going to take a few years to do this. And I would like to think that DCEO would help in that process, or that Illinois Revenue would, or the Secretary of State, people who may have those data about, how you can do it, even if you have to connect through them to the landowner. I mean, part of it is just making sure they're served that information. I don't mean served legally, I mean that they actually know now what the requirements are. So, and again, I don't like getting into legal stuff of any kind in terms of my response to you guys, so. Any other questions? You good?
All right, thank you.
All right, John?